I came to the United States as a kid from the Soviet Union when I was 10 years old. We settled in the Bronx. I did not know English, but somehow I was like remote controlled telepathically to a comic book store called Jimmy's Comics. And I somehow like made myself a mainstay at the store. I don't think Jimmy is with us any longer. But, he dutifully exploited us, gave us the opportunity to bag comics in exchange for discounts and free Cokes and so forth. And I basically learned English by reading comics. My mother had worked in the Hermitage, so I was really exposed to the highest caliber of European art, principally pre-modern art. But still comics, when you look at it from a kind of more zoomed out perspective, it's still classical drawing. It's still the figuration of that very certainly kind of pre-modernist attitude. And so for me, it felt like an incredibly organic transition to move from that experience of classical art into superhero comics.
Hello and welcome back to the MO podcast. My name is Jonathan Neal and I am here as always with my host, Joey Flores. And today we are very pleased to welcome Peter Rostovsky to the podcast. Peter is an artist, an author, an educator, and a graphic novelist who has exhibited work at some of the best museums and institutions, including PS1, Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Center, the ICA in Philly, the Blanton, amongst others. He has a couple of interesting parallel practices, though. First, he's an accomplished critic and theorist with essays written under the pen name David Gears, which we'll talk a little bit about today as well. These essays have appeared in journals like October and magazines like Bomb and the Brooklyn Rail and Freeze. Secondly, and very interestingly, Peter is an award-winning comics artist and graphic novelist. He has contributed to Devil's Due publishing titles, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Freshman Force, and Talk Bernie to Me. Peter's own graphic novel, Damnation Diaries with Uncivilized Books, received the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Arts Award of Excellence. It was listed by the New York Public Library as one of 2023's best comics for adults, and was nominated Best Artist for 2024 Rigo Comics Industry Award. Peter, welcome to the MO podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
So I think to kick things off, we've known each other a long time, but I want to talk a little bit about your background as an artist, but also the decision and the impetus behind moving into a kind of parallel track of comics and graphic novels and doing that type of work. When we first met, I knew you as a painter, quite exceptional painter, quite an intellectual painter, and someone who thought very deeply and intelligently about not only the history of art and the practice of painting as a craft, but as someone who sort of had a very sort of cogent idea about what it meant to be operating in that space as an artist. And then there's this seemingly 90-degree turn into something that would seem almost anathema to quite a lot of painters working in the 1990s and the 2000s, which would be going into straight up illustration, comics, and graphic novels. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about your investment in that shift. Why move into graphic novels from an otherwise bustling painting practice?
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I guess every comic book needs like an origin story. So just to clarify, my background is, I came to the United States as a kid from the Soviet Union when I was 10 years old. And so that origin story in comics actually starts really, really early on. And so we settled, we came here as refugees via HIAS, and we settled in the Bronx. I did not know English very well. I did not know English. I wasn't at all a fluent speaker. So I was pretty, lost for the most part. I was kind of dumped initially into a yeshiva, and then I, at a very young age, had myself transferred to a public school. which was also quite disorienting. And this is the South Bronx in the 80s. So this is really, to some people, a kind of, pretty rough context. But somehow I was like remote controlled telepathically to a comic book store called Jimmy's Comics. And for whatever reason, and again, I don't know what my like English proficiency was at the time. I can't quite remember. It was not great. And I somehow like made myself a mainstay at the store. I like embedded myself, and Jimmy, it's like Mitch from St. Mark's Comics knows Jimmy from way back. I don't think Jimmy is with us any longer, but he dutifully exploited us, made us gave us the opportunity to bag comics in exchange for discounts and free Cokes and so forth. And I basically learned English by reading comics, and I really, became like a comics nerd very, very early. To me, my mother had worked in the Hermitage, so I was really exposed to the highest caliber of European art, principally pre-modern art. And so I was very like, inculcated with that classical tradition. And so, but what happened, was this break from St. Petersburg and the Hermitage to South Bronx, which is quite, blighted at the time, and not where we were, but certainly around there. But still comics, when you look at it from a kind of more zoomed out perspective, it's still classical drawing. It's still figuration of that very certainly kind of pre-modernist attitude. And it sort of I've described this, it continues the tradition almost like how like the classical culture and mathematics were preserved by Islamic culture during the Dark Ages. So it kind of keeps these things intact. And so for me, it felt like an incredibly organic transition to move from that experience of classical art into superhero comics and at the same time, like the kind of avant-garde output that was happening in the 80s, because there's a lot of incredible innovation happening in comics during the so-called Bronze Age of comics. And so for me, that was like a very, very deep immersion. And I was incredibly invested in comics and illustration. I grew up in Long Island, which is really like, culturally speaking, felt a little bit like the boonies. It's very a kind of provincial culture, if you will. And I mean, it was a university town, but it was definitely like, the land of Boris Vallejo and Frank Frazetta and lots of like, pink puppy paintings and that kind of stuff. And so comics for me was like a big lifeline. And we know each other from, I don't think we were really pals at Cornell, but we know each other from like the, early moment in our youth. And so it was really only in college that I sort of drank the Kool-Aid of the avant-garde.
Hmm.
That is to say, the kind of like the heroic myths of I don't think they're myths, I mean the heroic tales of great advancement, innovation, and martyrdom. And but up until then, I really kind of was thinking like, well, I cared very deeply about painting, but even when I look at my early stuff, my early work, there's a lot of it is heavily weighted towards illustration. And so I think just to kind of speed this up, this tale, I think what happens when we reach middle age, I think a lot of us, we kind of go back to the early passions of our childhood. This is where artists reach their kind of mature phase, their golden age, as it were, where they're like, hey, actually, this like ember that I kept glowing all this time, there's something to it, and there's a real density and richness to it. And my work already had been moving towards public art and moving towards a kind of filmic understanding of painting is intertwining with text. I was already developing this writing practice, which I became very passionate about. I realized that I was around like fellow craftspeople who cared about the written word. And so for me, it was just like, well, what can really fuse all of these concerns? Like I was, we know each other also through the whole like Occupy Wall Street ticket. I was really concerned with accessibility and making work burst through its political cloisters that fine art tends to really like entrench. and moving towards that public dimension, really concerned with a kind of filmic aspect of art. And it was a kind of like, well, dude, you like comics, like that's the ultimate fusion, that's the orchestral fusion. And so, I can go on about it, but I think that that was it seems like a 90-degree turn, but it's a kind of understanding that I already had something that addressed all of these concerns. And I did have a lot of enablers, principally from the art world, who were like, you could do this, you should freaking do this, you know? And so it was actually a big push from a lot of my art world friends who were not like, why are you doing this? But we're like, why aren't you doing this? So anyway,
I recall having one of those conversations as well. I think we were sitting at a bar on 23rd Street. I can't remember, maybe that place that was like 23rd and 10th Avenue on the north
yeah.
side of the street, and you were thinking about going into this, and I was definitely a an advocate for making that shift, but I would never have given myself credit for actually boosting it along.
Oh no, it was a huge chorus. I should also mention that there was I went to we're sort of like full circle here. I'm sure it's inevitable that we talk about the political landscape, but I went to McDowell in 2016 just before Trump got elected, and it was like this kind of summer idol before the
Mm.
shit hit the fan, as it were. Um, and I remember just being surrounded by all of these writers. And during Open Studio, I had a few pages. This story from Damnation Diaries was published as a short story with just two illustrations. And so I had like all of my paintings around for Open Studio for Metal Day. And then those illustrations, and people just kind of, like agglutinated. And they just like to the drawings and the story. And I was like, well, like, hey, like, what about the paintings? And then, the writers there, and then David Macy, who's the director, who's I don't think he's like supposed to do this, but he was like, why not just make a graphic novel? And then Dan Fox, who was my editor at Freeze. So, and you, of course, and there was like this kind of chorus. And I have to say, when I wanted to abandon painting when I was in the Whitney program, it was a similar chorus from all of my conceptual artist friends. They were like, dude, don't do this, like you should do this. And so it felt like an interesting echo. It's like, okay, well, you should do it. So I just did it.
Give our listeners just a brief précis about what Damnation Diaries is about for those who are not familiar.
Okay. So Damnation Diaries is a satirical it's a horror comedy that takes place in hell, and it's about a sinner in hell who after 300 years decides to get therapy from hell's only therapist, Fred Greenberg. And so I've described it as a kind of chthonic memoir. It's been described as a parafiction. It's definitely obligated to, Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in tone, and shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or films like American Werewolf in London, or Things We Do in the Shadow. And is it What We Do in the Shadows? So it has that kind of approach where it's certainly a political satire, like, so it's very heavily drawn from current events, and my own navigations around New York, the art world, the cultural sphere, the academy. But it is a comedy, and it's I've described it as a labor of love and suffering.
What did your mother think about your early attachment to comics and comic books coming from such a classical high art tradition as she did?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have to say that my mother was she's definitely featured in the book in a kind of proxy form. And she's a huge, the book took a very long time to make, and it basically was going to press just as she was essentially dying. So it's a very, very tough thing for me to kind of like wrap around that on some level. My birth as a graphic novelist coincided with the passing of, someone so important, to just, everything. And certainly, like, I think my greatest teacher in terms of art and culture. Um, So, but she had always lamented that I gave up drawing. So I don't think she was a huge fan of comics. But she definitely applauded the fact that I came back to drawing, because during all of that time as a painter, drawing really took a backseat. And, I've been trying to kind of um, understand these different pivots in my life. And the only thing, maybe for you as well, like Hegel was kind of an important model to try to understand not only history, but also one's own, like, how should one say, about faces. And so I think it's, to me, it kind of makes sense. Like I had abandoned drawing, and then I was like, no, why abandon drawing? I should go back to drawing. Then it's like, I'm a writer and I'm an artist. Wait a minute, there's a synthesis here. That's comics. Or what are those other forms? And so, like the low-hanging fruit in a sense, given my experience would be comics. Um, and so I think she was really gratified that I came back to drawing. And now, of course, I'm in the project of trying to fuse these things together, because I certainly don't want to abandon painting either. So that's for me the great, task. MO is to bring that back in a much more kind of like holistic way.
I still think we need to have a wah 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 whenever somebody says him on the show. But um, Peter, question. I'm going to make an assumption here, and you can just correct me if I'm wrong. But like when you were younger and you were just getting into comic books, was it the traditional Spider-Man, Superman, etc.? And at what point, maybe if that is true, did you break away and find like a graphic novel or a series that was totally different than the sort of like classic superhero archetypes? Like what books maybe influenced you, and sort of what was your path in terms of like genres and things like that?
Yeah, that's um that is the question that I think is like it's so pivotal to a lot of artists working in comics. So, admittedly, I did not really experience the indie comics world or the graphic novel world until much, much later. And so my entrance, so I wasn't like one of those people where like they discover Raw or they discover Mouse, like, at an early age, or, like now I understand Persepolis is being taught in high school, in like social studies. So for me, it was definitely an exposure to mainstream comics and like that kind of old school, smelly comic shop. Like Jimmy's sold comics, like a lot of Jack Kirby, which I just hated at the time, and and like porn, like it was like a really super like city experience. And it's just like anything that sells, we're just gonna funnel it to the buyer. And so it was not like the high culture of comics that we would associate right now with indie comics and graphic novels. However, I think this is what was so special in the 80s, is that there was a lot of innovation happening. So Frank Miller was just starting to basically develop his voice. Even in the late 80s, I was collecting Electro Assassin. So that's Frank Miller writing Bill Sienkiewicz, who is I think one of the key like importers of painting. And when I talk to fine art people and we have like conversations about comics, they kind of say under their breath, it's like, well, the book that really like rocked my world was Electro Assassin. And so like as an adult, I started rebuying this stuff to see if it holds up. I gobbled up Pete Craig Russell, who I think is an incredibly innovative artist, who was working on Elric, but also in Marvel at the time. John J. Muth, Jay DeMatteis, writing essentially kind of like Eastern mysticism, but like via Doctor Strange. And so what I feel like was exposed to, there's Moonshadow, for instance, that's DeMatteis and John J. Muth, which is, like a Bildungsroman, set in space. And so this was really like adult literature, as it were, and very, very sophisticated art that was pushed through the mainstream, because that division had, it was getting set up. And I'm certainly not a comics, historian, but my understanding is like right now we have this very clear choice. Like if you want superheroes, you go here. If you want memoir, and more experimental style, you go here. And I think what I was very lucky to kind of like intersect was that these experimental projects were being pushed through the mainstream because the comics world was really small. And when I see panels right now, like Annie Nocenti, who I'm friendly with, who's a Marvel editor, she basically said it's like, it was her job to push through, to fight, for these projects. And at the time, the comics world was just way more permissive. And so as a kid, if you were reading, if you were reading Daredevil, for instance, that entire saga with Elektra and Bullseye, like that's a very, very serious adult saga, and it was just given to you on the platter. So that was my like early exposure, and I discovered all of, so yes, like early stuff, I definitely read like, Daredevil was a huge influence, the What If, X-Men, Chris Claremont, um, as I mentioned, like Moonshadow, Elric, like all of these things which are considered mainstream, but to me were very, very progressive and hugely innovative. Alan Moore working again for Swamp Thing. And I brought that back and I was like, I don't know what the avant-garde is, but I think this is avant-garde. You know what I mean? And at the same time, I had like a Hans Hacke book, that my mom would get me from the SUNY Stony Brook Library. It's like, I don't know what the avant-garde is, but I think this is it. Because I think it had the same spirit of just essentially raising hell and bucking against the system.
It's interesting. I think that I have a theory that includes the academy in this, but you talk about the 1980s as being this kind of moment of sort of innovation, late 70s and 80s being this moment of sort of innovation to a certain extent within the mainstream of these comic titles. And I think a lot of those writers and artists came, at least some portion of them, through the academy in some dimension on the GI Bill and were exposed to or had this kind of access to a whole range of literature and humanities education that was sort of there for the taking, that ultimately upped the stakes for what kind of stories they wanted to tell and how they wanted to treat the form of the work, but but with understanding that they needed to do it within inside of a more sort of mainstream framework, right? That they were going to operate inside a kind of world of entertainments, but there was no reason that that world of entertainments couldn't address itself to some deep running, long running narratives and challenges that really go to the heart of kind of human struggle and human character. I remember, to talk about it in these high-minded ways, but the X-Men for me was really sort of foundational in thinking like there was a lot of kind of relationship dynamics and histories and personal attitudes and whole sort of dimensions to these characters that are being developed across multiple versions of those books. That's not just about sort of action and not the sort of early 1950s 1960s type of wham bam Batman type of thing, right? And so I haven't thought about it in to a great extent, but there is this kind of advancement of the field that takes place as it kind of gets filtered through, at least in the intellectual development of some of these folks, the kind of classical, for lack of a better word, education.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that definitely in the indie comic space, it's definitely true that art school, in terms of its more traditional guys, plays like a big role. So, Chris Ware started out as a
Right,
painter.
right.
Alina Kaminsky-Crumb was also an expressionist painter. So there are many artists who kind of get essentially defect from art school. When I was in part of this communal studio before COVID, we had I think at least two people who basically came from painting MFAs.
Right.
And there was something that was kind of unsatisfying in terms of maybe, let's say, the narrative breadth of this. But it's been my experience in comics, and I think that's interesting because it's like it does feel kind of polarized to me. I was a bit surprised to find that polarization in terms of the two markets, let's say, or the two attitudes. But the one thing that does unify it, and I think it's and it's kind of, for me, it's been a good kind of orienting tool. It's just book people, and book people are incredibly, incredibly well read and incredibly smart and
Yeah.
incredibly curious and incredibly articulate. And, comics, I think, like the art world, it's this incredibly rickety, faulty system that allows people, you know, a certain degree of expression, and we can definitely talk about how that's been constrained by the marketplace of the comics. But it's having been on panels and certainly having attended panels, it's been by and large like very academic in terms of the kind of caliber and sophistication and nuance of discourse. It's not like you suddenly, like let's say, like move into a different attitude. Like people are immensely thoughtful, and just brilliant, brilliant across the board. The only thing that I think is different is that I think people give themselves license to be a lot more vulnerable in terms of how they articulate their projects. And so that kind of and so I agree with you that there's a certain kind of rise of um, I don't want to call it like academic culture, but I think it's definitely true that if you're thinking of and this is like when I see veteran people, on panels, what they talk about is that Marvel was a cosmopolitan culture. It was a New York culture. And in that, it absorbed all the energies of the city. It absorbed the film world. It absorbed the theater world. It absorbed the writing world, and it was a little bit like SNL. It's having its kind of 50 years anniversary. And it takes you back to that early moment where you really see it as part of counterculture. Back here, there's Camelot 3000, which again is, it's Brian Boland, his first, I think, American project. And he's coming from, 2000 AD. That was like, it's a DC title, but full, like, you know, advocate advocacy, queer love pushed through the mainstream, so immensely progressive. And I think, again, like really speaking for that kind of just incredibly like inclusive, energetic space. And I think that, just being part of these communities, I think I would imagine everyone wants to be part of these communities where, they're not at all like segregated. You're hanging out with writers, you're hanging out with poets, not to say that that's not right. You're hanging out with fiction writers, poets, artists, filmmakers, people from theater, performance artists, and so on and so on. And I think that is the kind of stew that I'm very indebted to. And I imagined a lot of these, not imagine, I know that all of these people who are very influential on me also come from that world. Now I think it's being very professionalized in a way, and I do wonder if that's kind of a tricky proposition.
Peter, in talking about sort of these different art worlds and where they're siloed, where they're not siloed, and things like that, I'm curious. Like, you have a very multidisciplinary practice: painting, sculpture, graphic novels. You're a critic. Um, when you start to have an idea for something you want to express, how do you choose which medium you're going to use for a particular project? And maybe this isn't a follow-on question, but I'm also just curious about, a painting may only take 30, 40 hours or something like that, but a graphic novel, is a very large investment of time. And I'm curious, like, how do you decide, like, okay, I'm actually going to, like, this is going to be something that on the graphic novel side, or, when do you decide like something that you want to put out to the world is worth making that kind of investment of time versus something, another form that maybe doesn't take quite as long or as much commitment as a graphic novel would?
So I think a lot of I've been trying to kind of crunch this. I do teach a class that braids painting and comics. So we come to this fork in the road. I don't want to use that that term. we come to this decision all the time. And I basically think it's a question of like a lot of programs, just to go back to the question of the academy, what they've done is they've sort of rebranded this in terms of narrative arts. And I think for me, the question of narrative is really the thing that allows one to understand both painting in terms of its kind of conventional, like terminus, let's say, at some, in the 19th century, and then comics, and especially where these time-based media like film, and I think comics is a time-based medium, take over, because painting is, I always describe it as kind of like this blunt tool. It's like, ugh, you know, feel sad, melancholy, uncanny, uh, longing, that kind of thing. And the moment you try to kind of articulate something with incredible specificity, which is like, I feel sad because our world is falling apart and we're being held hostage to a maniac who's assumed the reins of power. The moment you try to like flesh out that narrative, you basically fall into something that operates like propaganda. And so you need a tool to be able to articulate that kind of in time. And so for me, I think comics is precisely that tool that allows you to articulate very jointed narratives. And painting is, because of its open-endedness, its ambiguity. For me as an artist, I think it's necessary that it remain ambiguous and open-ended. And that's, Jonathan and I were corresponding about the question of autonomy. That's very dear to me, that you sort of retain your interpretive autonomy. You understand painting as, let's say, an allegory of current events as opposed to their representation. However, that you do have all of these tools to represent the world in far greater, with less ambiguity, and that's where comics, I think, for me, um, is really important, because I get to kind of narrate these things with some degree of detailed specificity. Humor is, for me, that's a big part of my life. It does not get expressed in my art. I make very, very moody art that is pretty not it's not funny, and that's, my paintings are not I don't think they're funny at all. However, I like humor, and so for me, like, that's sort of how I decide. But I think a big thing, and this is again something that, since Jonathan and I know each other from the art world, it's sort of like I can kind of report back in terms of like my discoveries, in terms of both of these spheres. And so I think that, comics is that space that, one, it allows, of course, a kind of public address. The art world is very, very cloistered in terms of its audiences. And then the other thing that is, I'm certainly not the only person to say this, but like, Cliff Chang, of Paper Girls of fame, it's now a show on Amazon. Basically, I think it was in Harvard, and wanted to make movies, but then he was like, well, like, that just feels kind of like too complicated. And so comics is basically film on a page. And so for those of us who think filmically, or who want to orchestrate our ideas in this very kind of like, let's say, like, Wagnerian way, where you have evocation of sound. You don't have olfactory oh, no, that's also possible. But you have all of these incredible dynamics told through a visual medium, and it is totally symphonic. Like, all of these things are happening at the same time. And to me, I think that's a key principle in film. They're very much like kindred disciplines. And that's huge, to have that outlet. And so for me, I think that's like the key question, where if you feel limited by painting in terms of its kind of monadic quality, and its limits in that kind of sad, red quality, it gives you, all of a sudden, you get to make a movie, and for like cheap, like, if you're working digitally, there's not even any overhead. You could just make a freaking film and tell your story, however ambitious it is. It could be like galactic in scope. And I think that's really for the students that I teach, like that's a big, big thing.
I really want your next painting show to come with the title "My Paintings Are Sad," or like the title for a can ugh,
Uh,
uncanny.
Jonathan, so
Yeah.
I do have a painting show planned that I'm hammering out at the Carolyn Glasso Bailey Foundation next year.
Oh, amazing.
And yeah, and so I'm like back to the canvas, and there's going to be a comic like wedded to it. And so like that's my goal, is to kind of fuse these two. But it is definitely like all the images very much show the influence of my navigation within comics. They have a very different sensibility. And but I do think it's for me, I think we always think of these either or types of scenarios, and I think oftentimes they're very economically driven, so
Yeah.
it's like and I understand that, of course I understand that, but I really long for that kind of holistic understanding where we give ourselves license to just, if time allows, and of course that's a big question I think many of us struggle with. Um, but to just give ourselves that freedom, like I know you're into science fiction. Um, I want the Jonathan Neal, science fiction story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an interesting aspect there, to go back to this idea about narrative. A couple things I was thinking of when you were just talking is that like the graphic novel, the comic, the storyboard is this very filmic, very kind of very let's say forgiving to a grand storytelling enterprise that allows for an individual or a small group of individuals to be able to execute something of a grand vision without having to execute with a grand budget,
Right.
and without also, a grand budget, but also without a sort of grand team of people. And I think that's the other thing, is that there's a kind of, you think about filmmaking itself. Filmmaking, when it comes down to it, is this kind of ridiculous logistics orchestration, right? I mean, just like the endless, capacity to try and capture these images, moving images, at any level of actual craft means conducting people more than it means conducting techniques in a way, right? And so you're agglomerating a whole range of expertise that's housed inside of other people's minds and bodies, and trying to put those things to the best use. And everybody who works within those industries sort of does really understand that, even at the end of the day, the awards go out to writer and director and producer, et cetera, that there's just like such a extensive use of other people. And so the if you were to put these things on a kind of spectrum, you've got that, you have film at sort of one end. Certain kind of theatrical productions begin to sort of come down at a lower end, and then when you were talking about the comics, what I always thought was very interesting is that, these are collaborations, right? I mean, there are authors of the words, but there's artists of the work, and there's it is a collaborative environment. You work within the studio, and then it sort of begins to draw down to these more singular activities where you have kind of author
Yeah.
and painter, which are
Yeah.
highly economical, but are, put almost the sort of greatest stress and strain on, the individual as this autonomous maker, right? And that autonomy sort of is meant to be expressed in some way in the work that is then being produced. So I'm curious for you, how do you feel now? I mean, your graphic novel was obviously very much a solo operation. I mean, something, you
Yeah.
wrote and art directed and everything. But having worked within these studios with other people and in these collaborative environments, and understanding those dynamics and the culture of those studios, how do you feel about that kind of move back and forth across the sort of boundary of solo operation versus collaborative operation in producing these things?
Yeah. Well, so I think again, like this is basically an economic problem that mainstream comics, especially monthly comics, floppies, um, there because the pace of production, so it requires a certain kind of division of labor. So you have the penciler, inker, traditionally speaking, uh, colorist, letterer, and then of course editor, then maybe even designer and so forth, book designer. And so it has like all of these different rungs that it needs to pass through in order to stay on schedule. And with indie comics and graphic novels, very frequently they're just solitary passion projects. And they certainly get editing and all kinds of formatting, and then you collaborate with people, at the various presses. But for the most part, you're really kind of left to your own devices. And so I think that part of it is just a question of a kind of like the marketplace. I personally, I think like what I understand and don't understand still about comics is its various like how should one say, it's like it's different like territories, like to me as a relative outsider, or perhaps as a kind of naive observer participant, like it's all comics, like it does not, I don't see any separation in terms of the subtlety of the language. The people are clearly bouncing across the field, so they go from DC to then really kind of high end, quote unquote, um outfits and so forth, and and back. And so it's this kind of like musical chairs in terms of people are just connoisseurs of the language of comics, and they're really incredibly passionate about it, the way filmmakers are. But I think what happens within that, of course, is that there are different enormous pressures. And those pressures, I think, are really analogous to the film industry, where you have these massive operations like Marvel and DC that have become corporate over time. But they weren't like that before. They were just much more kind of like from the hip, as it were. Where I remember hearing on one panel, it's like, you would be able to pitch something at Marvel, go down the hallway, and basically green light it, and just like, yes, let's make this happen. And now, of course, that it's part of Disney, it's incredibly complicated. DC, there's all of this question of, merchandising and funneling it into different spheres of entertainment. And so I think that that's where, that like assembly line production model happens. I think it's kind of a necessity for just the production for many, many comics. But the one thing I have learned, and I have to say this has been my epiphany, and I think this is definitely the case, like Klaus Janson, who's quite legendary in the comics world, was kind enough to come talk to my comics class, and he basically said, like, self-publish your book, because this gives you an enormous amount of freedom. And now we're in the Substack revolution of criticism and thought and political analysis and so forth, and we're likewise in the self-publishing revolution. And I think this actually has a lot of bearing to do with the art world, as these systems start getting more like embrittled by these, geopolitical forces, economic uncertainty. I think it's really, really prudent to treat every project as a self-published autonomous venture, you know. And I think that artists who I know who've always had the mindset is like they are painters without a gallery. Gallery comes across and they collaborate with it, but they are not like like locked into it necessarily.
Right. Beholden to it.
Beholden to it, yeah. And I was going to say wedded to it, but I think it's that kind of attitude where it's obviously both good and bad. It's very precarious, but that attitude of a freelancer or kind of navigator who is simply finding productive outlets for their vision. That's the thing that's constant. The collaborations may change, but that vision, that MO, again, is the telos of, that's the life's work. And to me, I think that's been like my big kind of ta-da moment. It's like, okay, well, like if I want to paint, I'm just going to paint. If I want to make a book, I'm going to make a book. When I wrote criticism, I totally wrote it on spec. Like the essay that you edited, you taught me such a valuable lesson because we cut 1,000 words. And John was like, it's doable. And I was like, no. But then at the end, I was so grateful but I had already been developing it, and I think that for me is like how to navigate that spectrum. I think it sucks economically because people are really like, being a freelancer is very, very tough.
Yeah.
But at the same time, autonomy is a beautiful thing for an artist.
So this will be a question that goes back to your work as an educator a little bit, but are you at least somewhat hopeful for a, lack of a better word, renaissance in a kind of creative, innovative, energetic, vibrant, relevant cultural production that may be on the horizon? Because I think that there had been a kind of, and this is just at this point feels kind of cliche, a kind of exhaustion of the creative fields across the board, whether it was in writing or in filmmaking or in the art world, certainly that that sort of came along with the rise of the sort of institutional mindset, a kind of a sclerosis that comes from a kind of overinvestment in institutional frames and even sort of commercial outlets. And you mentioned Substack. I think that's a good example, especially from the kind of criticism, journalism, commentary environment that points back towards points back to the sort of the trouble that newspapers and journalism have been having, for decades now since the rise of the internet. But I think about essays like Dean Kissick's in the Harper's, which I think maybe was the sort of last gasp of a kind of exhaustion that people feel for what's happening within the art world. To the fact that everybody was pointing at Marvel and DC and these comic universes that have been gobbled up by large movie studios and regurgitated and repurposed over and over again for big budget entertainments. There's only so long that could persist. Now we're in a radically different political moment with a kind of institutional destruction happening from the top down as well. I think there's a huge amount of pessimism that goes along with that feeling, at least for a lot of people right now. But I also get the sense that there's this kind of, well, shit, we've got to do it ourselves, right? Like we can't rely on the institutions or the commercial mechanisms, these other things to come along. So, there's this kind of resurgence of this attitude that you'd have described as a kind of, self-publish, DIY, get on Substack, write on spec, do the work that you feel like you have to do, make ends meet, however you feel like you can make ends meet, but don't compromise on what it is that you think and feel should be happening or should be created. And that will create a huge amount of ferment at ground level, at street level, and we may see radically new things happening. And even, for example, I mean, institutionally, people talking about, I haven't seen it, but the Brutalist as this Oscar favorite and the sort of transformation of what's being lauded by the Academy itself. I never put a lot of store behind that, but there's a maybe a feeling that we're sort of into a moment that has more to offer, especially at street level. And so this gets around to my question. Do you agree? Do your students agree, right? Are the students that you are with and this sort of next generation of creators and makers, are they enthusiastic or are they pessimistic?
It's hard for me to gauge because, of course, I just started teaching this semester. I'm like a week and a half in, and this is after the election, so it's hard for me to register that sense of pessimism. I think the one thing that is absolutely true in terms of the conversations that we're having is that there is, what Ben Davis has referred to a kind of neo-Luddite turn in terms of there's a real interest in analog media. And so, you'd be surprised, like there is definitely an openness to talking about AI and seeing how it could be incorporated into various workflows. But for the most part, like the kids, quote unquote, they want to do ceramics, they want to do darkroom photography, they want to draw, they want to paint. And so I think that what's really interesting is that every time that there's a crisis, there's a really massive crisis happening right now in comics. The art world, of course, is having its downturn. And in the comics world, the biggest distributor, Diamond, just filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy and does not look good. And so this distributor had a virtual monopoly on the comics field. And I'm having a very like analogous conversation with my publisher, Tom, who's, incredibly, incredibly smart and knowledgeable and, if you ever want to have someone on, is a good person who kind of straddle a lot of these fields. But it's kind of a similar question, whether it's, that will re-energize the comics field, whether it'll just generate all of these kind of peer-to-peer networks. We have the technology right now in terms of self-publishing where the books look really good, like you don't have to do giant runs, print runs in offset printing. You can do these like pretty beautiful books for cheap, locally.
Yeah.
And so there's that question of whether that's going to kind of like revitalize the field in some way, if these periods of profound crisis, the same thing in art. It's like, will all of these avant-garde energies emerge out of this dismantling of larger institutional structures? And I think that the jury's out, because 2008 for me is really interesting, because we thought like, well, that was it. The art world's going to end. I remember like Marion Bosky just being like the website was not like being updated. Like it just felt like this giant hulking ship stuck in the middle of Chelsea, and it really felt like that moment where like, well, now we're just going to see a lot of like scrappy production and performance art and video and all of this, like reemergence of like, unmonumental, for lack of a better term,
Right.
um,
That's just because
stuff.
the art world didn't understand economics.
Exactly. And instead, what's happening now is that there is a re-entrenchment, there's a run to safer waters. And we talked, I know, at length about this, the so-called gold standard, where you would people, you know, and because comics is so much also, I mean, people need to make money, like it's important for publishers, distributors, and so on. And so it's a real question whether or not this is going to, like, if Diamond folds, it's going to kind of, it's the Pandora's box of avant-garde energies, and it's going to be like, yes, everyone's going to self-publish this, it's going to motor the comic book industry out of its field, out of its whatever kind of stasis people perceive it to be in. I don't necessarily feel that, but and same thing with art. Or like with art, it's pretty clear. Like, do you see any video? And when you come to New York, no, it's all painting. Do you see any sculpture? No. So it's like people run to safe waters, And I really don't know what's going to happen, but I really do believe in like the avant-garde principle. Like to me, that's not a naive thing.
Yeah. My prediction there, and we'll have to come back in a year or two and see whether this is right. I think it'll appear in a resurgence of photography and photo-based practices for the art world. So not video necessarily, because again, I think that like, think about the one thing that's been totally sort of moribund in the last 10 years, right? Is photography. Sort of like the market's fallen off a map. The practitioners are just not the same as they were any longer. There are some amazing photographers out there, but in terms of the medium that runs closest to a challenge for digital image making that AI seems to threaten and would have the most opportunity to transform, photography and photographic practices might be the place that artists come back to or address in some sort of integral way, which is also still can be pretty scrappy and less expensive, rather. I mean, like video is still time-based, difficult to sell, difficult to show, difficult to embrace, is often, inordinately 99% bad, to be totally honest. Whereas I think, I don't know, I may be wrong, but I think you'll see more photography going forward.
I definitely feel like, my one, I think it's been incredibly like instructive for me. as someone who navigates both worlds to understand the art world from a distance. And so without necessarily being like economically determinist, I think it's pretty, once you put that prism on it, it's interesting to kind of understand the patterns and to understand these like dialect, I don't think they're dialectical necessarily, but these like shifts from extremes. But you know, just I want to touch on the Kissick Gate thing, because that on some level, I mean, obviously it's just like this giant explosion that happens in the art world because he expressed not everything that a lot of people are saying. It was, the text thing is, we all agree, is profoundly problematic. But however, there are certain things where it expressed a generalized fatigue, let's say, or a fatigue with a you know, one could say a kind of institutionalization or conventionalization of, you know, particular approaches. And but I think what's going to happen, my prediction is that because that now Trump and all are federally mandating the dismantling of identity politics, there's going to be a massive resurgence of it in the
Yeah.
cultural sphere.
Yeah.
Because the one thing, as a Russian, as a former Soviet, I know about Americans. Americans don't want to be told what to do. And so, and so let's say there was a kind of like organic fatigue with certain discourses that was happening. And I think it's in evidence, you know, across the board in terms of how criticism seems to be shifting. And we experienced this before, you and I, in the 90s, right? Because it was like identity politics and kind of turned into the discourse of beauty. Kevin McCoy and I was like, oh, hey, wait, David Hickey is now getting republished by Zwerner, or there's
Yep.
there's you know, like another like sighting, you know, of Hickey in the recent art form, you know, is, I forget what it's called, like the beauty treatment.
Right.
And but I think this was before this federal initiative. And so my sense is that maybe Kissick was onto something, but I think that's all going to get reversed. And so in terms of practices, I have a feeling it's going to actually really rekindle identity, a kind of focus on identity. And I also feel, you know, I don't think it would be the case if Trump wasn't such a cartoonish kind of emblem of that Jesse Helms type of approach, you know, an approach, Jesse Helms type of like, you know, hammer. And so I'm really interested to see what this, because I think it actually does like reorient us in a really massive way.
Yeah.
You know, but that again, this is just shooting from the hip. Saying, I had a conversation with a student about this last night, who was also kind of like noting this general transition away from this discourse. I was like, don't be so fast, because this was before it became officially forbidden.
Right. Well, it's going to be interesting to see, you know, whereas it was a kind of soft confrontation over questions of representation, and from the kind of nonsite.org, Walter Ben Michaels, Adolph Reed camp, where identity politics was the conscience of the right's economic program of a kind of neoliberalism, right? It was perfectly coincident with the, you know, the redistribution of incomes upwards. Now it's fully political, right? It's not merely a question of combat within the cultural field. Now it's a question of identity politics being an actual cudgel in the field of let's say the really existing political sphere, right? Of people losing their jobs, or, you know, not being able to go to work because at one point they had, I just listened to this on a different podcast this morning in the car driving my daughter to school. You know, someone whose job was to, you know, cancer researcher, was to do outreach to minority populations in order to, you know, get the largest samples for their drug discovery research. And because that was listed as part of the job description, that job is no longer there, right? And you look at that and you're just like, okay, right? This is, you know, real effects, real lives, real research. And so it's going to become a whole different type of reaction to that. Be interesting to see how that plays out within the the world that takes representation very seriously, which is the art world, the art creative sphere.
Well, I just want to maybe draw the analogy to Weimar, to that kind of cabaret culture, as it were. And I think the art world, it's, to me, if I can speak to it, and I think it does kind of overlap with the indie comics world to a certain extent, that it's a question of also like what is your, let's say, like your identification within like the theater of fantasy, right? It may not be real economically speaking, right? Because we're all part of a larger, like we're all participating in capitalism, like we, have to a certain extent. However, it's like self-identification is that it's somehow counter to these spheres, even though it's embedded within the collector network. Obviously, people are voting in a very heterodox way. Patronage system is, weighted towards republicanism, the Republican Party. However, it's still the kind of identity is like, no, we are a bulwark against this. And I think that now that we have something that is so like reminiscent of the 80s in terms of that type of, cartoonish conservative policy. Though some people would argue is like, well, actually, no, it's, read Steve Bannon and he sounds like, Occupy Wall Street and blah,
Nope.
blah, blah, comic popular. But still, like if, but to me, like being a child of the 80s and early 90s, it's like there's so many historical echoes that are happening right now. And so I think it's really fascinating to understand how what we'll see in the cultural sphere will also like parallel those developments, whether it's going to be like, all of a sudden Jenny Holzer will seem like incredibly fresh, this kind of agitprop attitude.
Hope
Wait,
not.
I know. You're like, oh, but seriously, but that kind of agitprop attitude in the arts will all of a sudden seem like necessary. And again, this exactly what I described, the kind of sad, like the Morandi position, which I'm really like, that's my thing. Like
Right.
I'm a indie guy, and whether like that's going to be like this is not the time for Morandis. We're at war. You mount the barricades, or if it's going to be far far weirder because we're just in a different economic template because so many people have access to production
Yeah.
and expressive conduits. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
And God, I hope it's weirder because I mean, I think back to bring the conversation back to comics and to science fiction. They're really, allegory, complex representation thrives when there is a culture of censoriousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when that censoriousness comes from the political regime rather than from the cultural regime. And I think that there's been roughly a decade where people have felt like a lot of that censoriousness came from the cultural and intellectual ranks. And what ends up happening there is you get very two-dimensional representational schemes and narratives, right? Very agitprop, very propagandistic, because it's thriving on its own kind of messaging. When it comes from outside, right? When the cultural environment feels like in order to, or when an artist feels like in order to write or make the kind of work they want to write and make, but there really is a genuine threat, right? There really is a genuine coercion coming from top down for the institutions with this kind of double-mindedness that, someone like Václav Havel wrote about so eloquently. It's like, that's where you get the really interesting longevity of a introduction of very interesting sort of cultural products, right? Of, people who want to say and want to make things, but understand that, or maybe don't have the gung-ho cultural GI Joe attitude of running headfirst into the breach themselves, but are the clerk on the side working in the logistics department, but yet have an active imagination and feel like they need to say something, but can't do it in such a forthright way. And, that's, I mean, the best science fiction came out of those types of attitudes, right? I mean, I think some of the best art comes out of those environments, and exactly that was the argument for Morandi.
Yeah.
Is there's a there is a way of reading those things as cultural artifacts that may have the intention of the artist embedded in them, but may not, but still make them incredibly compelling for that reason.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're echoing a lot of stuff that I've talked about with people where, these sort of repressive moments when there is an actual force that is, like it's totally institutional, how one navigates around it. And I definitely believe that allegory and, this very multi-layered understanding of the artwork, where it has all of these countertexts, it has all of these allusions, it kind of functions, quite cryptically and addresses different audiences simultaneously. To me, that just is a bonus to the artwork because it's just offering all of this complexity. And especially that's, I think, very much the case in painting. And of course, that's a very like poetic type of construction as well.
Right.
So it's sad that we kind of need a real crisis to evolve that type of artwork, but that is the kind of the model that I ultimately believe in. I do think that the institutional, like kind of to go back to your earlier point, because I think it's true for the academy, it's true for comics, it's true for art. Like there's a way in which these various institutions at this point, and this is the kind of like on the right, this is my understanding of like people's skepticism about democracy, that like Yarvin, for instance, like that somehow these various institutions are so worn, they're so conventionalized, they're so like corrupted by their political alignments or economic alignments, that they can't be like rehabilitated or revised in any way. And I don't believe that. I definitely believe in reform. And so but that said, I do believe in when these systems stop supplying that kind of free reign of expression, when the academy does not allow scholars to, explore the things they want to explore, these kind of para-academical academic programs where all of a sudden, you're, like what is it, the Brooklyn School for Social Research
Yeah.
and other, Black Mountain College was one of these things. I think those are amazing gifts to culture. Same thing with publishing, and that's of course the origin of most independent um, presses. And that's certainly true for galleries. Like now they're big institutions, but back then, I mean, we remember what it was like in the 90s. Soho was just like tiny. These were tiny. These were not mammoth Chelsea spaces. These were
Right.
kind of fly-by-night operations.
Right.
And I feel like that's the way culture gets built. And I think they're necessary times of replenishment where, some crisis happens and then, okay, like go, you have a budget of $500,
Yeah.
see what you do with that.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And it's also, there's this kind of maybe there's an allegory to be written just about the kind of real estate shifts in New York City because, if the transformation of Chelsea into, as at one point the kind of post-industrial landscape of art galleries and in the 90s and the 2000s has now, after the decade-long leases were up and the expenses of staying in those places rose so high, everyone shifted down to Tribeca into, pre-World War II constructions and, much smaller spaces and ostensibly lower rents. The very architecture of arguably America's primary sort of commercial outlet for contemporary art will have something to say about what kind of things are being made and what kind of exhibitions are being made going forward for the next 10 years because of the way that everything has sort of shifted into that downtown over the last 5 years.
Well, we had this very interesting question come up in painting class. How do you determine the scale of something? And I'm like a believer that, well, like the work wants to be a particular size. Morandi does not want to be a massive tableau. Look, Toyman's painted it still up, but it's huge. Um, so, so for me, there's a kind of like organic fit. However, very interestingly, there's an ArtNet article. Why is small work so big right now? And I think it correctly asked the right question, which is that, if we were looking at these various trends, they follow other trends. Real estate, Dutch still life, the golden age of Dutch still life is a merchant class decorating their apartments.
Yep.
It's no longer architecture. And so I think this is what happens with a certain kind of, we can talk about this broadly. Like I'm really fascinated by genre. And if the peril of diamond, shuttering, um, if it means a kind of flight to safer waters, it may mean the rise, the superhero comics may be more important than ever, because this is the kind of like home, like this is like bread, this
Right.
is like a staple. Bread, give me bread, I need to survive. And so we may see that. In terms of galleries, we've seen this in terms of painting and really genre-based painting. So stuff that's not like massively adventurous, but just like, nudes,
Yep.
flowers. Kevin called it florals, which I think is a really interesting kind of proxy term. And so genres get re-entrenched, still lifes, landscapes. And again, from an art historical perspective, they've never been, to quote Jane Seymour, it's never been out of style. Some people say genres back, it
Yeah,
never went
exactly.
out.
It never went
So
out.
they never went out. So we're always kind of, on some level, like mired in genre. But I guess the question is like, to what extent these moments really drive it. And I think, going back to the question of identity, which I find very, very fascinating, because for me, it's that kind of anthropocentric guarantee. Like, what is it that we want so desperately as animal beings, navigating this decaying rock, this burning rock of a planet? We want human stories. We desperately want that kind of, just to understand the like triumphs and sufferings of another individual. And I think that's why AI has a very, very limited kind of foothold in the cultural sphere, because I think it can do stuff in bulk. But I think, as in sports, we don't want to see people like heavily jacked up on steroids doing inhuman feats. We want to see like
Yeah.
something fundamentally relatable and frail. And I think that's where art and I think that's where the kind of resurgence of like the biopic, or however you want to, something that really centers the individual in terms of their history, their location, their identity, their perception. I think that's why it's important. And I think it's getting, I'm not sure, contra Kissick, it's going to go away, because that is a fundamental like axiom of our experience of art and narrative. Like we want, most short stories, sci-fi stories, they begin with an I,
Yeah.
it's either third person or first person.
Yeah.
So for me, that's like a kind of, to plead the humanist card, that's an indelible part of our experiences, human experience.
100%. I was just reread Stanislav Lem's Solaris. Hadn't read it in a long time, but that is for all things that one can say about that book in terms of the sort of advance that it made in terms of trying to sort of understand, another mind, an alien mind or an alien entity, and really push that idea to its furthest extent. The book is about human characters dealing with their most sort of human, deep, tragic encounters with themselves and with others and with other human beings, right? And 85% of the book, when Lem's not just trying to describe these crazy efflorescences of this planet being that the space station is orbiting, it's about these characters dealing with one another and then dealing with the emanations of their kind of deepest, darkest secrets manifest as this entity on a spaceship. I mean, it's a fundamentally human story, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that, again, to kind of go back to something, you know, that as artists, I think sort of comes for us all to a certain extent. I mean, you wrote that really beautiful piece about autonomy in your parents, and I think that, I think art fundamentally is a reckoning with our mortality, with our fragility. And to me, I guess I still feel like that's a very like a kind of higher calling of it, that it puts us, it gives us a compass for navigating the world. It provides institutional memory, And so for me, that sense of connection, I think that that is about as close to a universal as we can get to. Obviously we live across, everyone is separated by massive chasms. But I think getting in touch with that sense of like fragility and struggle, I think is really an important conduit to kind of, bring us together.
Hmm.
Peter, do you have a hard stop at the half hour?
No, I can keep going.
Okay. We have a segment we
Offline.
like to do at the end, but I have a question that maybe multi-part, and I don't know if I'm opening too big of a can of worms. So, uh, you worked on this, collaborated and contributed in this project, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Freshman Force. I want to both understand, like, a little bit about your contributions there and like why you thought that this particular series was an important work to do, and then add on question to that, your thoughts, maybe put on your critic hat, but also your comic book artist hat. What do you think of The Boys, and the way that it comments on politics now, and also, sort of the way I think it's hilarious again when people don't realize the political undertones, and when
Yeah.
conservatives find out only on season 3 that Homelander is a stand-in for Trump. Like, I find this so fascinating. And so, anyways, I'm curious your thoughts on both the your own work in the political comic book arena, and then this quite successful show covering similar topics but in a completely different way.
Yeah. Well, I definitely feel comics, and I'm sure you've uh, this is a kind of mantra, but it's like to use academic language, it's always already a political medium. So it is charged with a political investment. They get smuggled in. Many people into mainstream comics. Many people cite Captain America, punching out Hitler as a case in point, but it tells, deeply political stories, especially when it's based in memoir. And that, I mentioned Spiegelman, certainly books like Persepolis, to any number of contemporary books really take on the kind of political cause. For me, it's obviously important or it has been important. No, that has been. It's still important to have some aspect of my artistic practice function politically, and I think that that's in part, that project when it was offered to me, I think it really gave me an opportunity to express my convictions, my belief in that. Like many people, I was a big supporter of Bernie Sanders in terms of his candidacy, and so that's definitely just an important kind of offshoot or outlet for me artistically that may not necessarily get expressed in painting, but again, I try to find other conduits through which to relay those beliefs. The Boys, I think, is very, very interesting because I love this show, and I know I'm not alone. And I think it's one of the most astute political critiques, in terms of understanding um, how our, like science fiction, like any speculative fiction, it is an amplified vision of reality. But I think that amplification really gives you a sense of how real and true to life, how acutely observed it actually is. So for me, The Boys, I've recommended it as actually one of the more kind of astute political analyses, in the same way that Jon Stewart, for a lot of people, offers a really, astute understanding of the news. I think The Boys is a great prism through which we can look at this country. I have to say, I think it kind of became more on the nose as it evolved as a series, and so I liked it more in its earlier, iterations. But to me, it's still a really kind of perfect example of how something that is incredibly dark, incredibly funny, can still function very, very, as a piece of very, very shrewd, astute political analysis and be entertaining. And as someone who like came up in the 80s, in early 90s, that idea of like infiltrating the mainstream with a kind of Trojan horse model where something could be, like Verhoeven, because is another good example, of something like Starship Troopers, where it functions like incredibly gripping entertainment. The Boys is incredibly funny, it's very engaging in terms of character development, but in that you have that nugget of political critique that, as you say, like some people don't even get because it's so surreptitious. But I think that's an amazing model for how art can kind of navigate these systems.
Should we move on
It's
to?
an incredible show. It's so weird. Yeah, let's move along to the more opinion segment, we call it, of the MO podcast. Um, so, Peter, first question that we like to ask all of our guests is: if you were given a budget of $10 million to launch a new creative project or enterprise that had to be, a little outside of the scope of what you normally do. Can't be, oh, I just want to enhance my studio, or I want to, create another book, or what have you. If you had to do something very like different from things you've done in the past, but you had $10 million to do it, what's something you would like to embark on, either as a project or a venture?
Well, I think so. Is it like philanthropic or something that's more in terms of my own creative
Totally
ambitions?
up to you.
It's up to
Totally
you.
up to
It
you.
can be philanthropic, but it can't be, "Oh, I'll simply give, my 10 million to Planned Parenthood," right? Like if it's philanthropic, it would be more along the lines of what kind of nonprofit or philanthropic venture would you seed or want to bring into the world?
Okay. So I am a child of museums. And so I'm a child of museums and libraries. I'm not really a child. I'm in my 50s, but deep inside, I think I'm still a child. However, I'm certainly the product of museums and libraries. And so I think one of the things that I think this is the one thing that Russian culture did right. They did an enormous amount of damage in other spheres, but this thing they did right. People had access to so-called high culture. People had access to museums, people had access to literature, people had access to all of these things, at least when I was young, when I was growing up. And so if it was philanthropic, like Julie Meritu just gave, $2 million for the Whitney, basically to give like free admission to young artists. I'm a big believer in that museums should be free. Everyone should have access to it. There should not be some kind of psychological like firewall that forbids you from going and looking at a Ribera, or Caspar David Friedrich. It's going to be a big show right now. And so for me, that kind of idea of culture as a commons is really important. And for me, I think it kind of cultivates the brain. I think even though there obviously, museums are full of all kinds of, very, very big problems in terms of patronage and how they're in bed with all kinds of unsavory forces. Still, I believe in art as a kind of shared set of engineering problems, like if you look at it like that. And so for that, I think it's really important that everyone should make the museum their home, and everyone should treat it like that. And I think that's a kind of a beautiful thing, the same way that a library, like I think a local library, amazing, just to have access to it. So that would be the philanthropic thing. I think if it was me, selfish me, I guess I'd want to like make a film. $10 million, that's literally like 3 minutes. So it's not ambitious, but I probably want to make a movie. So, that's not related to what I want to do. I want to plug something. In my old age, I rediscovered YouTube. There are all of these amazing animation shorts that Mary and I consume, and much of it is student film. And that speaks to exactly that kind of Substack revolution, where there's a lot of just amazing, amazing stuff being put out for just, our like collective ennoblement.
That just sparks a random question. Have you ever been to the Spike and Mike's Twisted Animation Festival?
No,
Oh man,
I have.
you should check it out. I don't know if they
Okay.
still do it. If you can find any like old stuff about it, you used to come to Sacramento. I mean, it was all coming all over the country, but Sacramento came to one of these old theaters downtown, just like single theater, old, hundreds of seats, and you would see the most twisted cartoons. I can't even on this pod, despite the fact that it's for adults, I will not retell some of the things that I saw there. But yeah, I think I think the Simpsons may have had a bit of a debut
Oh, wow.
at this Twisted Animation Festival. But yeah, I mean, I saw something that just blew my mind. Look up a cartoon called No Neck Joe. It's just like ridiculous about this guy who's got no neck, and all these people are always playing pranks on him where they're like looking up and trying to get him to look up, and every time he does,
Yeah.
he falls over, and it's just like
Yeah.
ridiculous. But well, you're kind of you did a call out already. Our second question actually is like, what's a project in the art and cultural sector that you're excited by and that you would like to bring more attention to by somebody else?
Well, so, I was very fortunate. Like when I started working on my book pretty much in isolation, but then I joined the comic studio, and it was a very it was a kind of a sad tale of gentrification. My painting studio, which Jonathan had visited back in the day, I was in it for 15 years, and the rent went up 35%. And I was already using it basically to just, work on a comic. So it definitely felt a little, not cool in terms of my application of it. However, as I moved out the very next day, Dean Haspiel, who's a very good friend, helped me move my chair and Wacom tablet into what was then Gowanus Comics Artists, which was a kind of WeWork for comics artists. And so, there are many wonderful artists who work there. But I'd want to give a shout out to Dean Haspiel. He has lots of amazing kickstarted campaigns. He's definitely a comics veteran who's worked across indie and mainstream, and is an incredibly generous mentor to a lot of comics people. I've called him the Pied Piper of comics, where you're like, I think I want to make a book. It's like he'll bring bring you in as well. And so he's been very supportive. He's just an amazing creator. And he has a recent Kickstarter project called Chest Face, which is very, very unique and weird, but in the best way possible. And then also my friend John Allen, who has a book, also from the studio, has a book coming out, I think, very, very soon, called The Well. And I was a reader on this book, and it's a really wonderful story. It's science fictional. It's very personal, very funny, really beautifully articulated. John also comes from painting, from Cranbrook. So I'd want to support, their project, and I hope people will look out for them and support them as well.
Nice.
Great. Jonathan, you want to ask the last one?
Yeah, final question. If there was a work of art, cultural artifact that you could steal to have for yourself, not share with others, just for your own personal enjoyment, what work of art or cultural artifact would you acquire?
Okay, so I would, this is a really tough one because, again, just to go back to the kind of aging leitmotif of this conversation, as we get older, we get okay with our so-called bad taste. And so my bad taste has taken a real liking to the symbolist movement and artists like Fernand Knopf, who used to really freak me out when I was a kid. And I was like, what the fuck is this? This is, I hope, if you're not allowed to curse on this, feel free to like bleep that out. However, okay, so Knopf, it scared me for a while, but now I'm a big Knopf fan. And so there was a painting that I spent a lot of time with when I saw it, and it was his painting. I think it's called Listening to Schumann, and I think he and Geez, I feel like he and maybe Max Ernst, I think they had like a falling out over it or something like that. If memory serves me right. Okay, but it's an amazing painting. And so I would definitely like steal that, even though that's like, but Knope is like my bad taste. My high taste is Vermeer's Little Street. And I think that Little Street painting is that what we were talking about, the kind of that's the Morandi vibe, that's the ugh street, ugh, little street, person sweeping. However, it just says everything at the same time. It says everything about the so-called human condition. We are all little sweepers on our little streets, and that's what brings us all together. Our little creaturely condition under that blue, at times very, very oppressive sky. And so I would definitely thieve that and share it with my loved ones.
Nice. Peter, thank you for joining us on the MO podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and great to see you both.